Welcome to today's 6Ps podcast episode and our first on the novel The Memory Police. Today's episode is going to run through some background information that is important to know prior to reading the text. So just to give you an overview of what we'll look at today, we'll look at some setting and context information, we'll delve into the plot, some characters and themes, we'll touch on the text construction, some linguistic, stylistic and structural features, and we'll also look at what influenced this novel, as well as the purpose and reasoning behind writing it. Let's start with the basics though, and this was first published in Japanese in 1994 and was translated into English in 2019. It's a science fiction novel written by Yoko Ogawa, and she's a celebrated and well-renowned Japanese author. Yes, it's science fiction, but we also call it, I guess, a dystopian text with a dystopian setting on an isolated Japanese island, and we'll look at that setting in a moment. But I do want to run through a summary to start with, and just a heads up, there might be some spoilers here, but I think it's important to run through the plot just quickly. So as I said, it is set on an isolated island. We're introduced to the narrator through an interaction with her mother, who shows her items or objects which have been disappeared. In the subsequent chapter, we find out that our narrator is a novelist whose parents died when she was young. She befriends an old man who lives on an abandoned boat, and we find out that objects disappear on this island due to the memory police who control it. They wish to rid the island of any individuals who have the ability to remember the past. So there's a real dichotomy on the island, those who can remember and those who can't, and the memory police want to essentially get rid of anyone that has the ability to remember. Now, the narrator's editor, R, confides that he can remember past objects and has a memory, and the narrator provides him with a secret room in which to hide. In the meantime, the memory police ramp up their grip on the island, becoming more abusive and violent. Roses, novels, calendars are among items that disappear, but as they cannot remember, residents adapt very quickly. The narrator continues to protect and assist R in surviving, although there is one very close call. Following an earthquake, the old man dies before citizens start losing their limbs. In the end, the narrator manages to finish her novel before losing all her limbs and her voice. R, the editor, leaves a secret room at the end of the text, leaving the narrator behind. Now, running alongside this story is the narrator's novel, which is about a typist and her abusive teacher who holds her captive. So there's a story within a story. In terms of the setting and the time period, it is set in Japan post-World War II. There's no explicit date set, but there is a reference to television, so we can assume it's a little bit after World War II. Now, I've got some quotes here which the author uses to describe the island. So it says the mountainsides are covered in thorny trees, which is, I guess, why they can't really escape. There is no map of the island either, so we could probably suggest that maps were disappeared. There are no passengers on board a ferry, and it can no longer take them anywhere. So once again, they're stuck on the island. They can't escape. And then in terms of the environment, I guess, there's a quote on page 97. It was the first time in ages that snow had fallen. Snow is a real symbol. It becomes very cold and a bitter long winter in this text. And page 135, it's quoted that spring will never come. So when we're talking about the atmosphere in this text, it's winter, it's snowing, we get this real dystopian flavour throughout the text, that things keep getting worse and worse. So I just wanted to run through some historical context in terms of Japan, where this novel is obviously set, particularly the early 20th century history. So in 1931, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria. They were keen to gain, I guess, control of the eastern part of Asia. Manchuria is a section between the Russian border and the Korean peninsula. In 1933, they withdrew from the League of Nations, which is, I guess, an iteration of what we now know as the United Nations. Now, there are two incidents at 1937, which are really important. The first one in July, which is known as a Marco Polo Bridge incident. This was an attack by Japanese forces on a town in China, which led to the commencement of the Second Sino-Japanese War. And the second one in December was the Nanjing or Nanking Massacre, which was an extremely violent event, which many historians have referred to as being a genocide. So Japanese forces killed between 40,000 to 300,000 men, women, and children. As I said, it was extremely violent. The fact we don't know exact numbers probably suggests that a lot of this information has been censored, and that's the important part of this in terms of relating it to the text. We have, an authoritarian government that censors information from its citizens. Now, in 1940, towards the start of World War II, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, which was really signified their involvement in World War II, which was, I guess, underscored in 1941 in December when we had the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now, in 1945, following American forces dropping bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan surrendered, and that was the end of World War II. I guess it's also important to look at Nazi Germany when we think about this text for a couple of reasons. The first one is totalitarian regimes. So the memory police in the text instill fear and complete control over citizens, much like the Nazis. Few, if any, are able to stand up against it, and those who do try and stand up against it are punished immediately. I want to talk about persecution as well. We know that the Jewish population were persecuted, tortured, and killed by Nazis, not just in Germany, but throughout Europe, with a death toll of around 6 million. Now, in the text, it's individuals with memories who are targeted and forcibly removed. Now, with escape measures, Jewish people would seek refuge or flee in fear of obviously being taken by the Gestapo or taken by Nazis. And similarly, in the text, characters who have memories attempt to flee or hide in the text. If they were caught, not only were they punished or taken away, those assisting them were also punished as well. The other thing I wanted to mention was book burnings. Obviously, these were widespread in Nazi Germany in 1933, but there are so many other historical examples of book bannings or book burnings. We can go back and look at the Reformation of the Catholic Church around that time as well, where the Catholic Church banned books. But, a lot of governments have done it, and it's something which provides them with the ability to control information and also, I guess, to censor and hide information as well in order to maintain their complete control over the citizens. This, of course, happens within the text as well, where books are not only removed or disappeared, but they're also burned. Let's touch on a couple of the characters. We've got our protagonist, the narrator, who was a novelist whose parents died at a very young age. She does not have the ability to remember, but she does show empathy and compassion for those who are punished by the memory police. She has very strong relationships with R and the old man, and the three of them form a very tight-knit group in the face of the memory police. Speaking of R, he is the editor of the narrator. He has the ability to remember and hides in the narrator's house, leaving behind his pregnant wife. Now he tries to rekindle memories in the narrator and the old man through objects, and he has strong thoughts on why memory is so important. With the old man, he's an acquaintance or a family friend of the narrator who lives on an abandoned ship. The ship, of course, can't leave the harbour because no one is allowed to escape. Like the narrator, he doesn't have the ability to remember, but isn't as fazed by the disappearances. Following an earthquake, which sort of destroys the ship, he lives with the narrator just before his death. The memory police, I guess, are a group, but we'll call them a character. They are a powerful authority who instill fear throughout the island, seeking out those who can remember and controlling what disappears. I wanted to note as well that most of the characters don't have names, but potentially we might touch on this a little bit later. Why does R and the Inui family, who appear early in the text, why do they have names and other characters don't? Something to consider. Again, we might touch upon this a little bit later on in the video. So looking at key themes, look, there's plenty that you could look at. The ones I think are really important though are loss, and that links in nicely to memories. And I should say, all these themes or ideas are interconnected. They all relate to each other. They're not sort of isolated. They all work in conjunction with each other. So loss, power and control, particularly the memory police, memories, identity, isolation, given that this is set on an island, voice, conflict, fate versus free will. We've got storytelling, particularly with novels being banned, the idea of community, of love, and violence, which obviously violence links in with the ideas of power and control particularly. So these are some of the key themes you might want to reflect on as you're reading through the text and consider what messages the author is sending about these ideas. It is not an exhaustive list by any means as well. There are many more themes that you can look at through this text. This is just, I guess, a small sample of themes. When you're reading the text as well, think about your next level analysis. You don't just analyze the plot, but you analyze how the plot is told. So using things like context, historical, social, cultural context information can be important. You can look at linguistic, stylistic, and structural features of the text, symbols and motifs, as well as authorial intent. This information you can use in your essays to showcase that you're going to the next level in terms of analysing the novel. Let's focus just to start with on some literary features from the text. So there's lots of descriptive language and figurative language throughout this text, including similes and metaphors, but really there's some nice detailed description of items and objects. In addition to that, the author uses personification, and all these literary features add depth to these objects and their value, especially given that a lot of these objects end up disappearing and no longer exist in this particular world. It provides them with, as I said, a lot more value. Now, names are something as well which are really important. So most characters don't have names, apart from R, who is the editor, and the Nui family. We could probably suggest that names might have disappeared from this society. Again, we might think about why the memory police might do that, to take away people's identity, because R and the Nui family do have the ability to remember. Perhaps that's why they've been given names. Symbols and motifs that appear throughout the text. You can look at snow. It comes up a lot. I think on one page, snow is mentioned about 5 or 6 times. So definitely look at that. You know, that I guess it's correlated to things like death. You've got statues and sculptures, you've got books and words and typewriters, and these all add to the dystopian atmosphere of the text. You can even look at the syntax. In the first couple of chapters, we have this phrasing, when objects disappeared, they had been disappeared. It's quite disjointed and jarring, and think about the impact of the syntax and how that plays on the way the text or the story, I should say, is told. In terms of stylistic and structural features, definitely look at the narrative perspective. So this is first person from the narrator's perspective. We see the world through the eyes of somebody who doesn't hold memories. And this contrasts with the experiences of R, who definitely can. Now, it is a linear structure, but chapter 1 is from the narrator's childhood. So it's told from a long time before when the storyline plays out. We could suggest there's some dramatic irony there because we have a bit of an idea about what happened to the narrator as a child before following a linear storyline. It sort of goes from start to finish. Something that makes this text so really unique, and because this makes it unique, I think it's definitely worth analysing, is the fact that we've got an embedded narrative, or a story within a story. So the narrator writes a novel in the text, and we get to read this in snippets every now and again. They appear in chapter 6, 8, 12, 15, and 18 at the start of those chapters, and then at the very end, it has a whole chapter, chapter 27. I want you to consider the plot of this and the positioning in the text and how it relates to what's happening to the characters, and particularly the narrator at the time. It also delves into themes of domestic abuse and patriarchal power, and also the idea of voice. So these are things that I want you to look at when it comes to the embedded narrative, but something that I think would be well worth analysing when it comes to essays in your exams and in your SACs as well. So there are a couple of influences on this text, and you might have read some of these texts before, but we can clearly see the author has taken sort of aspects of these texts and produced them in her own text. So 1984 by George Orwell is a pretty famous text. The idea of Big Brother and constant surveillance by strict and rigid authorities comes throughout. So we obviously know the phrasing Big Brother now through reality TV. There are parallels between the memory police and the thought police in their name, but also in the fact they try and control information throughout their societies, and just in general this overall dystopian atmosphere within both the texts. The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, or The Diary of Anne Frank, is really important too. This novel documents a young Jewish girl's experiences in evading Nazis and hiding from them during World War II. And Fahrenheit 451 by a very famous science fiction writer in Ray Bradbury. This is also a dystopian novel about an American town in the future which bans books, and the protagonist seeks to protect literature. So we can see that through these three texts, and again, if you've got the time, you might want to read through them, watch some adaptations to them, or read snippets from them to gain an insight into why perhaps the author wrote The Memory Police. Speaking of why the author wrote this text, I've got some quotes that have been taken from a New York Times interview from a couple of years ago, and these are some quotes from Ogawa. In the reasoning behind writing the book, she says, I wanted to digest Anne, that's the Diary of Anne Frank, Anne's experience in my own way, and then recompose it into my work. So taking a similar experience and placing it into a setting that she wanted to build. Ogawa did not intend to write a political allegory. She said, I'm just trying to depict each individual character and how those characters are living in their current time. She also says, Ogawa said she does not write about cruel characters to damn them, but rather to explore what might drive someone to physical and emotional violence. Quote, people try to hide it from others or try to cover it up, she said, but in the world of literature, you can reveal that nature and it's okay to do so. I've got a link to the interview as well in the show notes. So these are things that Ogawa have said, but there's other sort of, I guess, aspects you could look at in terms of what messages the author is trying to send. You could look at sort of ideas such as the importance of memories. You can look at corrupt and all-powerful authorities and the way that individuals try and rebel against those and fight against those if they potentially can, and maybe why they do so. You can look at aspects in terms of objects and possessions and their worth, beauty and value. That's definitely explored throughout the text. And I think there's also some philosophical questions that are raised throughout this novel and get us to reflect on what it is to be human. Objects that we have, limbs, even voices come up a lot throughout the text and really get us to ponder what it is to be a human being. So to round off today, just some things that you can do in order to prepare yourself for reading and studying this text. And the first one is to conduct further background research on the social, cultural and historical context of the novel. I think it's really important to read the novel for the first time just for understanding, to get your head around the plot, then a second time to highlight key moments and analyse themes and construction. And I can definitely tell you that the embedded narrative in this text is much richer when you read it for the second time as opposed to reading it the first time. And I always say this, but please do think about starting a quotation bank as soon as possible. You can group quotations into characters or into themes and into the setting even as well. And really look to build this early on, because that way you'll start to memorize quotations as soon as possible. We'll be back throughout the year with plenty more videos on the Memory Police as well. So make sure you subscribe to the 6Ps podcast.